Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing CSS Grid, which is yet another way to lay out content using CSS. And CSS Grid is particularly useful for when we have two-dimensional layouts. While Flexbox was great at laying out elements in a single row or column, especially when we wanted our websites to be flexible and scale naturally with the screen size, CSS Grid will give us similar properties but with more granular control on the exact locations that elements will end up in, especially when we have multiple rows and columns. So to show you how this works, let's get right into an example. Here in this HTML file, we have a body, and inside of the body, we have a header with a h1 that says top level heading. Then we have a main tag with an h2 as well as a paragraph. And then we have an aside tag and a footer tag, each with a paragraph. And you can see all of this in the output on the right, as well as some basic styling we've added. And the goal of this is going to be to change this layout up a bit. And we want the aside content to show up next to the main content. So we want a top level heading at the top, sort of like we have it now. But then below that, we want the main content and the aside content to be in two columns. And then we want the footer content across the bottom. And of course, we could achieve this with Flexbox. It might be a little bit more difficult to figure out how exactly we need to do it, but we could do this with Flexbox. But I hope this example will show the power of CSS Grid and how it's really great for these multi-column layouts. So then in our styles.css, all we have so far is this rule set that is adding a 5-pixel solid light blue border to all of the direct children of the body. And the reason we are doing this is because each of the direct children of the body are going to be our grid items, and this will help us see the borders of the grid. So in this case, we're going to want our grid on the body. This won't always be the case, but for the example here, this is what we will want. So let's take the body and set it to display grid. And what this says is that the body is now a grid container, very similar to setting display flex and how that creates a flex container. So this creates a grid container. And then if we go back to the HTML for a moment, what this will do is it will take each of the direct children of the body and make them grid items. So the header will be a grid item, main will be a grid item, aside will be a grid item, and the footer will be a grid item. However, anything nested further in the tree will not be grid items. So for example, this h1 is inside of the grid in that it is in the header grid item, but it is not a grid item itself, in the same way as with Flexbox, the flex items are only the direct children of the flex container. Okay, so let's go back to our CSS and start making our grid. So the first property that we usually set will be grid template columns. And what this says is what is going to be the column structure of our grid. How many columns do we want and how large do we want them to be? And the way we set this is with space separated sizes for each column. So for example, I could say 100 pixels, 200 pixels, 100 pixels. So I can save this and we will get a 3-column layout with just that, the 100 pixel left column, the 200 pixel wide center column, and the 100 pixel wide right column. And then you'll see each of the grid items is just placed in a cell, and we get the number of rows by default that we need for each grid item. So since we had 4 grid items and only 3 columns, we end up with 2 rows and the footer content just gets pushed down to the second row. We usually refer to this as an implicit grid, because we're allowing the browser to decide for us how many rows we need exactly, just based on how many items we have. However, in a moment, we will see how we can change this into an explicit grid by being more explicit about the number of rows we want and where exactly every item should be. So one thing you might notice here already is that we are using pixel values for the widths of these columns, and that's probably not the best thing to do. It's not going to scale super well. So what we can do instead is use this special unit that is a FR, so 1 fractional unit. And what this says is take up as much space as I can, but do it proportional to other FR units. So for example, 1 FR, 2 FR, 1 FR. And when I save, what you'll see this does is it takes up the entire width of the body now, and the middle column is now twice as large as the first column and the third column. Now, one other concern you might have with these fractional units is we don't want one of the columns to get too small. If somebody had a very small browser window and we had lots of columns and maybe one of them was only 1 FR, but one of them was 10 FR, we want to make sure that that one has some minimum size. And the way we can do that is by wrapping this in this function that is min-max, and then we set a minimum value. So maybe we have a minimum of, let's say, 200 pixels, and then we add a comma, and then the other value, which is going to be the maximum. And when I save this, you'll see the top level heading column, so the first column, got a little bit wider because 1FR was not 200 pixels. So if we change this to 20 pixels for a moment, when we save, you can see we still get 1FR of width, which is a nice behavior here. So it will use the 20 pixel minimum if 1FR was below that, but otherwise it will just use the 1FR value. So now for the actual layout we wanted with this website, we said we wanted the header and footer across the entire page, but then the main and aside to be next to each other. So we probably only need 2 columns. So I will erase this, and we will probably want the main to be a bit larger than the aside. So let's say we have 3FR, 1FR. And when we save this, you'll see we get 2 columns now, with the one on the left being substantially larger than the one on the right. Next, along with grid template columns, we can also say grid template rows, which is very similar to grid template columns. It just allows us to define the individual rows. So in our case, we need 3 rows, and we probably want the main middle row to be a bit larger than the header and the footer. So let's say the header is going to be 1FR, the main content will be 3FR, and the footer will be 1FR. And when we save this, you'll see now our main content is taking up much more space than the heading content, but we can't even see the third row because there's no content in it yet. There's nothing that's actually being pushed to that third row, but we will see in a moment how to move all of our content around to choose where in this grid it is actually going to be laid out. But first, one other small point I wanted to make is if we had a layout that was something like 1FR, 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 there's actually a shorthand for this that is super useful, so I just wanted to show it, and that is going to be to add the repeat function. So I could say repeat 3 times and then 1FR, and this will be the exact same thing as we had before with 3 copies of 1FR. So as I have it right now, we would have 5 rows each with 1 fractional unit, but I will get rid of this for now and go back to that layout that we had. So 3FR here in the middle. And finally, with relation to columns and rows, one last piece of terminology that you might hear is tracks. And a track is just another word for either a column or a row. So just do know that if you hear the word track, they're referring to either a column or a row within the grid system. But now we need to actually start laying out our elements. And first, let's look at the header. So we can add the header selector, and we need a way to say which columns the header is in. And in this case, we need the header across the entirety of the top of the grid. We want it to be in the first row, but we want it to take up the first and the second column. Now, there are a few ways we can do this, but first let's take a look at grid column start. And what grid column start says is, where does this grid start? Which column? But when we say columns, we're referring to the column lines. So the lines in between the individual columns starting at 1. So in this case, we want it to start at 1. And then we can also add grid column end. And we can say that this will end at column 3. So at the third line, which is the edge of our table, because we have 2 columns, which creates 3 grid lines vertically. And when we save this, you'll see now our heading is spanning the entire top of the page. Alternatively, I can comment out this grid column end for a moment. You'll see this goes back to the layout we had, but we could change this to say span 2. And what this says is take up 2 columns from this spot. So this is now spanning 2 columns. This is doing essentially the same thing we had before. And finally, we could also comment this out, and we can just use the grid column, which is a combination of grid column start and grid column end. So I could say column start of 1, and then we add a / to divide the 2, and then column end of 3. And this is essentially the same thing we had before. These are just different ways to create the exact same output. And similar to grid column, we have all of the same properties with grid row. So I could say grid row of 2, for example, and this would push our heading down to the second row because it is now starting at the second horizontal line. However, we don't actually want this. We want the heading at the top, so I will remove this grid row for now, but just know that that is an option. And we can remove these grid column start and end as well, because we won't need those. We can just use grid column. Now, one thing you might be noticing is that the numbers 1 and 3 are a little bit hard to read. You have to think about that for a moment and say, okay, what is the third grid line? So one thing we can do instead is we can actually give each of the grid lines a name, and then we can refer to them by their names later in the grid columns. So up in the grid template rows, we can add in brackets the names of each line. So for example, we can say left, and this will be left of this first column. And then the line that is in between the two columns, we can call middle. And the one on the right of the columns, we can call right. And then we can change this to be left and right. And we could do the exact same thing with the grid template rows. If we were using the row numbers, we could create some names for them and just make it a little bit easier to understand what they all are. But grid rows and grid columns are actually not the only way that we can choose where in the grid system a grid item is displayed. So we can actually go back to this grid container, so the body, and we can add grid template areas. And what an area is it's a rectangular portion of the grid. So it's some subsection of the grid, and we can give each area a name, and then we can just tell the grid items which areas they should be in. And the way we do this is with some strings that are separated by spaces. And usually what we do is we go to a new line, and you'll see why in a moment. It just makes everything a lot easier to read. So we can say at the top, so the first row is going to be our header, but it has two columns. So we'll say header, header. So the first two columns are both part of the header. Then we can go to a new line here and say that the second row, which we will put in a new string, is going to be our main and then our aside. And then the bottom row we will call our footer, and we will have two columns for the footer as well. And now, instead of having this grid column left, right, what we can instead say is that this is going to be in grid area of header. And when we save this, you'll see it does the exact same thing. Personally, I like this grid areas syntax a little bit better because it keeps all of the layout information in one place in the grid container. And then in the individual grid items, all we have to do is define which area they relate to. That said, either syntax is perfectly fine, and there are times when you might want to use one over the other. So next, let's define the grid areas for the rest of these elements. But first, I will also get rid of this grid column because we will not be needing that. So first, we can go to the main, and we can say it has a grid area of main. And then we can go to aside. It can have a grid area of aside. And finally, our footer will have a grid area of footer. And when we save this, you'll see we actually get the layout that we want. And this is super nice again because the body, so the grid container, contains the entire layout. So maybe we want the aside on the left instead of the right. And all we would have to do is go up to the grid template areas and switch this order. And now you'll see the aside ends up being the one on the left, whereas main is now on the right. And of course, we would probably want to also change the width of the columns, but you get the idea. So I will undo this and put the aside back for now though. And now I am noticing we're missing a semicolon at the end of the grid template areas, so I will also add that back in. Okay, so that is all there really is to laying out elements in the CSS grid, but there are some other properties we should see that will help us change how the grid is going to look and how the individual items will work within the grid. So first we can add the gap property, and this works just like it does in Flexbox. So I could say gap of 10 pixels, for example, and now you'll see each of our grid items has 10 pixels between them. And again, what's great about this is that because we used these fractional units, even as we add these gaps, everything still fits exactly as you would expect it to. Next, we can also control how the individual grid items will lay out their content. So for example, we can say justify items and maybe center. And what this will do is it will center each of the items, and it will no longer stretch them to take up the entire width of the page. We can also do align items center, and this will work very similar to how it does with Flexbox. Now our content will be vertically centered, and it only takes up the space of the content. We can also do place items center, which is just a shorthand for justify items and align items. So you'll see if I comment out justify items and align items, we have the exact same output. But for now, I'm going to remove all three of these because we don't actually need those for the layout we were going for. In addition to aligning items and justifying items, you can also do this on an individual item. So for example, I could come down to main and I could say justify self center. And this will center just the main, but it won't affect the other elements. We could also say align self center, and this will now vertically center it and stop that stretching. And we can also do place self center, which again is just the shorthand for doing both of these at once. But again, I will get rid of all three of these because we don't actually need those. Now that's all of the properties that we're going to look at for CSS Grid, but a final point I wanted to make is around nesting. So we can actually nest grids inside of each other, we can nest flex boxes inside of grids, we can nest grids inside of flex boxes, and so on and so forth. So for example, this main section, we could actually make a flex box. So I could set this to display flex, and now main is a flex container as well as being a grid item. And then we could use this just like any other flexbox. So maybe we want to justify content center and align items center. And then we also would probably want to change the flex direction here to column. And now we end up with this vertically and horizontally centered main section. And in general, this is how we will lay out our content. We will use grids for these two-dimensional layouts, and then we can use flex boxes for when we just need single rows and single column layouts. And of course, we can use flex boxes as well for multi-column and multi-row layouts. We just need to be a little bit more careful there because with flex wrap, we have less control over where exactly the wrapping will happen and which elements will be on which line. So with that, that's going to be the end of this video on CSS Grid. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.